In the previous section, we discussed all the core concepts of the Spring framework. Now, inside this new section, we are going to shift our focus towards the Spring Boot. Spring Boot is the most famous and most commonly used project inside the Spring ecosystem. The plan is first, I'm going to teach you what is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot. Why can't we build our applications with Spring alone? Why should we take help from Spring Boot? Once we have clarity on the core concepts of the Spring Boot, then we are going to start building our backend web application that is required for our e-commerce full stack application. As you can see inside this website, the Spring team, they clearly highlighted using Spring, we can build all these kind of applications. Whether you are looking to build an microservice application or cloud application or a backend web application or a batch application or a serverless application, for all these kind of applications, you can happily use Spring and its sub-projects. But building all these applications with Spring alone is somewhat tedious job. It is going to require some good amount of configurations and boilerplate code from the developer side. To overcome this challenge, Spring Boot project has been introduced by the Spring framework. We're going to explore more about the Spring Boot. But before I try to give you the introduction of the Spring Boot, let me show you a statement from one of the Netflix senior software engineer. This Netflix engineer is confirming that inside the Netflix, most of their services are being built based upon the Spring Boot. The reason why they choose Spring Boot or Spring Framework to build their services is the Spring is being maintained over many years based upon the demands from the developer community and based upon the new trends happening inside the IT industry. Spring and Spring Boot, they are continuously evolving and upgrading themselves. And with that reason, no one has to look for the alternatives of the Spring Boot or the Spring Framework. The same is the main motive or the reason for Netflix team also to choose Spring Boot to build most of their services. If Netflix is relying on Spring Boot and if they are able to cater all the humongous amount of traffic that they are delivering throughout the world, then I think any other project, they can happily and confidently use Spring Boot without any thoughts. This gives a confirmation to the newcomers that how mature this Spring ecosystem is. Just like Netflix, all other major companies, they are leveraging Spring Boot and Spring ecosystem to build backend services. I hope you got some confidence around the Spring Boot. I know you may have too many questions like what is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot? I will try to clear that doubt in few minutes, but before I try to give you the introduction of Spring Boot, I want to show you an image. This is not a funny image or it is not a funny meme. This image confirms how powerful Spring Boot is. If a Java developer tried to build a web application without taking help from Spring Framework or Spring Boot, the developer may end up writing millions of code because the developer needs to take care of building all the supporting components like security, transaction management, caching, session management, all the supporting components they need to build from scratch using plain Java code, and that's why developer will end up writing millions of code. Whereas if the same developer take help from Spring Framework, the number of lines will drastically reduce from millions to thousands. The same is observed by the developers when Spring was introduced initially. After using Spring to a great extent for 4 to 5 years inside the industry, everyone started thinking that Spring can be optimized further so that developer can focus simply on the business logic. That's where the thought of Spring Boot came into picture, and that's how Spring Boot was introduced after 4 or 5 years of Spring introduction. With Spring Boot, the number of lines that developers they are going to write is drastically reduced. Now the developer, they are going to simply focus on the business logic but not on any other configurations or the supporting components. This shows how powerful Spring Boot is. Once we start seeing the demo of Spring Boot, you are also going to realize how powerful this Spring Boot is. Let's try to understand what is this Spring Boot project. In simple words, I can confidently say that Spring Boot is the hero of the Spring ecosystem or Spring framework. Inside Spring ecosystem, there are tens of projects, but this Spring Boot is considered as a hero of all projects inside Spring framework. The reason is all other projects available inside the Spring ecosystem, they built around the Spring Boot project only. Without setting up a web application with Spring Boot, you can't leverage any other projects available inside the Spring ecosystem. I'm also going to prove you the same in the coming lectures. Spring Boot was initially introduced in April 2014 to reduce some of the developer burdens while developing a Java application using Spring Framework. With Spring Boot, we can create web application skeletons within seconds or at least within 1-2 minutes. If you feel seconds is too aggressive, maybe for a beginner, it is going to take 1 or 2 minutes to create a skeleton of a web application with the help of Spring Boot. When we create a skeleton with the help of Spring Boot, it is going to eliminate all the configuration that developer has to do to set up and start a web application. By default, Spring Boot, what it is going to do behind the scenes is, it is going to assume all the default configurations. It is not going to ask the developer, or it is not going to force the developer to define the configurations to set up a web application or to set up any other kind of application. Spring Boot will simply assume some default configurations. If developer is not fine with these default configurations, they are welcome to modify these configurations by using simple properties. All this is going to make sense while we are seeing the demos in the upcoming lectures. As I said before, Spring Boot is now one of the most appreciated projects inside the Spring ecosystem. It helps to create Spring apps more efficiently, and developers can focus completely on writing business logic. If you are aspiring to become a backend developer or a full stack developer, Spring Boot is a mandatory skill. Using this Spring Boot, you should be able to build full stack applications, microservices, serverless, containers, Dockers, cloud applications. Any kind of application that you can think of in the Java ecosystem, the same can be implemented easily with the Spring Boot framework. I know I'm pricing a lot about Spring Boot, and I'm also excited while discussing about Spring Boot. But believe me, my friend, when we start using Spring Boot, you will also feel the same. Before I try to close this lecture, let me clarify one important point here. Spring Boot is not a replacement for the Spring Framework. If you take Spring Framework as one big ecosystem, under this Spring Framework, Spring Boot is one of the project. If a developer is using this Spring Boot to develop a web application, behind the scene, this Spring Boot is going to leverage all the Spring Framework core concepts that we have discussed in the previous lecture. Whether you talk about beans, dependency injection, inversion of control, auto wiring, all those core concepts are used inside Spring Boot as well, which means behind the scenes, Spring Boot is relying a lot on the Spring Framework. Maybe I can try to give some analogy to understand the relationship between Spring Boot and Spring. If you consider Spring Boot as a hero of a movie, you can assume Spring as the director of the movie. We as the audience of the movie, we always see the front face who is the hero, and we appreciate the efforts that he has put to entertain us. But do you know behind the scenes who is driving this entire movie? It is the director. The same relationship applies between Spring Boot and Spring Framework. Without understanding the Spring Framework core concepts, you can't claim yourself as a master of Spring Boot. That's why I put good amount of efforts in the previous section to explain you about all the core concepts.